Welcome, ghouls. Do you guys hear that? Oh, they found me. I'll be right back. Sorry about that, guys. Happens every year. I think I'd get used to it. But start over again. Welcome, reindeer, carolers, and elves, to the first Christmas episode of the 2024 season here at the Hidden Creek Manor. So, because this is our first Christmas episode, we decided to kick things off with a very special build. You see, a few years ago, I built my mom this giant snowman out of wood. He was like 8 feet tall. He had all these parts that you could put on, and it was a lot, and it looked really cool. But my mom's getting older now. It's harder for her to put it up or take it down. Actually, I have to put it up and take it down every year. And my mom moved recently, and during the move, the snowman was lost. So this year, I'm making her a brand new snowman. But I'm going to make it a little bit different. We're going to make it out of foam instead of wood, so it'll be much lighter. We're going to make it shorter because my mom's a very short lady, and an 8-foot snowman was a bit much. So this snowman will be much more manageable for her. So why don't you guys join me, and you want to build a snowman?
All right, so first let's go over the supplies that you will need to build your own foam snowman. You'll need one 4x8 piece of 2-inch foam, one can of spray foam, some wooden dowels, some Drylock or Monster Mud, a bunch of different colors of spray paint, and some rebar or stakes to hold the snowman into the ground. So now that we have our supply list, let's start with building the snowman's body. So first thing I did was laid out my piece of foam, and then I previously built a plywood snowman, so I used that as my outline. Now I understand that you guys aren't going to have a plywood snowman laying around, so I'll explain how I got this original plywood snowman. I took a piece of string and measured it to the radius that I wanted for the base of the snowman. I tied one side to a nail. You could really use just about any sharp object. And then I tied the other side to a pencil. I put the nail right in the middle of where I wanted the snowman's body to be, hold that string as tight as I could, and then use that pencil to draw that outline of the circle. And then I just made it smaller for the head. So back to our current snowman build. Originally, this plywood snowman, I kind of set the head up a little bit too high. The head and the base just kind of barely came together. It didn't look natural. So I slid it down a little bit to make it look more like an actual snowman, where you would have to kind of push that head down to stick to the body. And once we got everything measured out, it was time to cut out the snowman. Now, I like using a hot knife to cut through foam just because it creates less mess. There's a lot of ways that you can cut yours, but a word of advice, if you decide to use the hot knife like I did, don't do like I do. I ended up going up and down in kind of a sawing motion at times. It just made it easier. But what I found once I finished is that it created more jagged edges that caused more of an issue when it came time to sand it. So if you can, just use one kind of smooth motion. With this 2-inch foam, it's gonna get tiring, your hand's gonna hurt, you're gonna wanna do whatever you can to speed it up, but I promise you, if you take your time and do it right, it's gonna make it much easier for you on the long run, so learn from my mistakes. And after cutting out the shape of the snowman's body, it's time to get out our sander so we can round out the edges. I don't know about you guys, but I have never seen a snowman with straight edges around the outside of it. It's always rounded. So we want to make this look as realistic as we can. So get out the sander, round off those edges. tried to film myself doing the entire snowman, but at some point my camera ran out of space and stopped filming. So, but you guys get the idea. You want to round out those edges to make it look like it's an actual ball of snow and not just a piece of foam that you just cut. And then after sanding the snowman, I had to go in with some joint compound and fix some issues. Now this was a spare piece of foam that I had laying around and it had some scratches on it. So I used that joint compound to fill in those scratches. But also, I get this question quite often actually. People say, what's the difference between the green foam and the pink foam? So you use both. There's really no difference other than just where you buy it from, depending on if you get it from Home Depot or Lowe's or another hardware store. I prefer the green foam. The pink foam has these lines in it that don't really help out when you're trying to create some type of decoration, so I have to go over it with the joint compound to hide those lines. But once we got rid of all those lines and covered up all those scratches, it was time to sand it all down. So not only are we getting rid of any mistakes that we made with the joint compound, but we're also giving it a little bit more texture for that dry lock, which will be the next step, to adhere to. And I ended up using 2 coats of dry lock. You could use Monster Mud. I just like dry lock. I like the texture, it's easier to use. And I've said before in some of our other videos, I like dry lock when it comes to making stuff look like stone because it gives it a more textured, realistic look. But the same applies for the snowman. It makes it look more like snow because it has those, little pieces in it that give it that texture. And one other thing I did to really kind of sell the effect is after I painted over the entire snowman with this dry lock, I went back with my brush and just tapped it pretty hard actually, to give it a more textured look, not only to hide the brush strokes, but also to make it look like snow that's been compacted together. And to finish off the snowman's body, I ended up adding 2 coats of white spray paint. Now I did use white dry lock. This might be a bit overkill, but it's nice and bright and white, and I guess the more the merrier when it comes to white paint on a snowman. So now that the snowman's body is done, it's time to move on to his accessories. And let's start off with the coal buttons on the snowman's body. So using a spare piece of that foam that we cut the snowman from, I cut out 3 circle pieces about the size that I wanted for those coal buttons to be. And after cutting those out, I grabbed my rasp, and this is really the same technique I used to make fake stones. You just kind of use that rasp at an angle to get rid of those sharp edges, and you don't want it to be uniform. You want it to be more organic looking and misshapen, more like an actual piece of coal or a rock. Now, as you can see, the rasp is quite messy, so once you're done using that rasp to get the basic shape that you want, then you want to go back over it and just kind of lightly sand it to get rid of any big chunks. You don't want to sand it to be smooth because you want it to look like a rock. But most importantly, because this is so messy, you want to keep a clean workspace, so when you get done, vacuum up or sweep up all those excess pieces of foam that you just sanded off. Now, because this is a 2-inch piece of foam, I found that it was a little bit too thick for what I wanted for the pieces of coal. So I just used my hot knife and cut a little bit off of the base, maybe like a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. But don't worry, we are going to use that foam later. We don't want to waste any foam. It's not cheap. And now that the pieces are cut to the size that they need, we've sanded them and rasped them, coat them with dry lock. And then once the dry lock is dry, I painted them with some flat black spray paint. So let's move on to this snowman scarf. Now, because I had that plywood snowman body already laying around, and I had some spare foam that I can put up against it, I used it to use as kind of like a template for my scarf, and that way it just made it easier for me to draw out the shape of the scarf that I want and the size of the scarf to fit on the snowman. You could do the same thing with the foam snowman. I just had this sitting around, so it was easier for me. But after creating that template, it's time to once again get out that hot knife and get to cutting. And since I use another snowman as the template, I placed it on our foam one just to make sure that it would fit, which it does. So now we can get to sanding to make it look a little bit more like a real scarf and not just a piece of cutout foam. And because this is supposed to look like kind of two pieces of fabric hanging down, we really wanted to make sure that that's noticeable. So I got out my smaller hot knife and I ended up cutting about maybe a 1/4 inch down into the foam to create that separation and to make it look more like two pieces of fabric instead of just one piece of foam. And then just like everything else, we coated this with dry lock and then spray painted the scarf red. And one thing I did not film, but I also cut a small circle that will be the knot that would be holding the scarf together that we'll see later on in the video. So now let's make a hat. So just like with the scarf, I took my foam and this time I put it under the snowman's head, and then I kind of just made my outline of what I wanted the hat to look like. I started with the bill and made my way to the top of the hat. I didn't want it to be exactly in the top, facing straight up. I wanted it to be kind of cockeyed, so I made it go a little bit to the side whenever I set it on the snowman and then designed the hat. And by now you guys probably know the drill, and I'm going to start to sound like a broken record, but next thing we want to do, cut the foam. And then make sure that it still fits and lines up properly, which everything looks good. So it's time to get to sanding. Now once again, whenever I cut this, I kind of did a sawing motion, so I had a lot of rough spots. So we wanted to even out those as much as possible, so I got out my sander and really tried to smooth this out so it looks more like an actual hat and not a piece of foam that has a bunch of rough cuts on it. And then, you guys know the drill. We dry lock it. Now one thing I did want to point out though, kind of different from the way I did the snowman's body, I wanted my brush strokes to be seen here, and I went side to side on the kind of brim of the hat and then up and down at the top of the hat just to give it a little bit more definition, so that way if you get up close to it, it should be a little bit more noticeable, the separation between those. And once I finished dry locking it, it was time to spray paint it. So I'm gonna have a red band in the middle that will separate the brim from the top of the hat, so I taped off that section, I spray painted it black. Once that dried, ripped the tape off, switched it to the black sections, and then I painted that strip of red. So let's move on to the snowman's eyes and mouth. So first thing, I took the bases from the pieces of coal that we cut for the body and lined those up on his face to see if they were about the right size for the eyes, which they were. So now that I know that, I use those as a kind of template to cut out the eyes. And really the process is exactly the same for the eyes as it was for the coal buttons. But now for the mouth, I mentioned earlier how we end up reusing those small pieces. I was able to get about 3 smaller pieces cut from each of those bases, so that way I have a bunch of small pieces to use for the mouth. So once I got everything cut out, I put it in place on the snowman's head to see if I had the right amount and make sure it's all lined up properly before I get into sanding and so on. So now that we know that it all works, we get out the rasp, we get out the sandpaper, we go through the same process that we went through with the buttons, and once again we got to keep our workspace clean, so we want to vacuum that mess up. And then dry lock. Once the dry lock is dry, black spray paint, and now we can move on to the nose. So first thing I did is I took the eyes and kind of lined up the nose with the eyes to make sure I had the right sizing and shape. And you want to make it a little bit smaller than what you want your final results to be, because we're going to cover this with spray foam, so it's going to get much larger. And then I took that outline that I made and put a dowel through the bottom of it to hold it upright, and put that into a piece of foam and just started spraying it with the spray foam. I tried to start the base a little bit larger and just kind of work my way up. And once the spray foam dried, well, first thing I had to cut the base so that way we can have a flat surface to connect to the snowman. And then I just started shaving off a lot of the excess foam. You know, that foam does expand when it dries, and we don't want this huge, crazy, knotty carrot. So I cut off as much as I could with my saw, and then I sanded it with my sander to kind of even it out, make it nice and round and smooth. Now, because this was foam, there were a lot of crevices and holes that were left behind. So I got my joint compound back out and just kind of roughly filled those in. It doesn't need to be perfect. It's a carrot. Carrots are not perfectly shaped. So if there are some kind of indentations and stuff like that, that just kind of adds to the realism. And then at the base of the carrot, I have that hole from where I had that wooden dowel earlier, so I filled that with some spray foam and took a 3-inch screw and put it in there. And once that hardens around that screw, that'll keep it held in place, so that way to attach it to the snowman's head, we'll just poke that screw through. I've got a nut and a washer that will then attach to the other side to hold it in place. And last but not least, it's time to paint the carrots. I started with kind of like a more of a muted orange color, and then added a little bit brighter orange over top of that later on. And now we can move on to the snowman's arms. Now, you could still continue to use your 2-inch foam that you're using for the rest of this project. I just happen to have a piece of 1-inch foam laying around, and I held that foam up against the snowman kind of where I wanted the arm to be, and that way I could kind of measure out the general length and the shape of what I want the arms to look like. This step does not have to be perfect, because all this is going to be hidden by spray foam, so if you make a mistake on this step, it's not a huge deal. This is really more of just like a skeleton that's going to be underneath your spray foam. And once we have those arms cut out, I drilled holes in the bottom of them to attach wooden dowels, and this is how we'll actually attach them to the snowman. And once again, because this is kind of the underside that no one's ever going to see, if it's not perfect, it's okay. In fact, I even made a mistake on one of mine and ended up having to just tape it at the bottom. No one's going to see it. Like I said, it's going to be covered in foam. So as long as you get those wooden dowels in place and you're able to spray foam over top of it, you're good to go. I kind of struggled with this a little bit. I thought it might be better to have them upright so I could get coverage all over, but with them being upright, the foam wanted to fall down, so I ended up having to do multiple coats and do quite a bit of fixing, but it doesn't matter, because at the end, the foam's on there, and now we can move on to kind of cutting it down and making it look more realistic. So just like with the carrot, I cut it first with my saw, I took out my sander, I sanded it down some. I was actually kind of running low on time, so I didn't spend as much effort on this as I should have, but it's okay. And I guess I did not film myself painting these, but I painted them with 2 different shades of brown and some black just to give it more of a realistic look. I mean, if you look at a stick in the wild, it's not going to be one shade of brown. It's going to have a lot of different colors, so we want to have that kind of variation. And to attach the arms, I kind of held them where I want them on the snowman and the angle that I wanted them. And then I took my drill out and I drilled the holes in the sides to be able to slide those wooden dowels into. And at this point, we're done building, so now it's time to assemble everything. So now we can lay everything back out onto the snowman where we want it. Once we have everything laid out exactly as it should be, get that spray foam back out, and we can start adding some foam, use it as an adhesive, and then put everything back in place. And then once that dries, they're not going to go anywhere. For the hats, I ended up using some toothpicks to help hold it in place whenever the foam dries. I also took a heavy piece of wood and stuck it on the other side of the hat just to make sure that it didn't come apart as it dried. And at this point, we are done building the snowman. So let's take a look at the final results before we take it to my mom.
All right, so now that the snowman is done, it's time to deliver it. And we're not just going to deliver it in a car. That's boring. This is Christmas. We're going to deliver this thing in style.
How are you gonna drive it on the road? There's no wheels.
Roads? Where I'm going, I don't need roads.
Bad idea! It's way too cold!
Quick update, guys. My mom wasn't home, so I wasn't able to deliver the snowman. So you guys are not going to get to see my mom's reaction in this video. Because she wasn't home and because I'm not able to show that to you guys in this video, we'll wait till a later video to show her reaction when we deliver the snowman. But for now, I'm gonna get back to editing this video. I'm gonna keep working on these janky VFX. And yeah, I only had like a day to work on them, so it is what it is. But anyway, back to editing. All right, guys, that's gonna do it for this episode. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I hope I can get all this out of my beard. But anyway, one last thing before we go. If you guys have been keeping up with the channel throughout the Halloween season, I mentioned that we launched our store and we were going to be selling merch and we were going to be donating money to help Hurricane Helene victims, and then the store didn't work. It's a long story. It's my fault. I got it all figured out. So the store is live now and we are going to extend the Hurricane Helene relief to the end of the year. So any purchase that you make between now and the end of the year will go towards helping victims of Hurricane Helene, so you could get some Christmas presents for your loved ones and help a cause while you're at it. So we're gonna go ahead and wrap things up. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you want to stay up to date and notified with everything that's going on here at the Hidden Creek Manor. But for now, happy holidays, and we'll see you in the next one.